Hello to historians, and welcome to our lecture over early Christian art, which we are talking about while we're covering Rome because this did develop within the Roman Empire. So it's kind of a very important part of our story for this. So we have kind of an idea in terms of the official birth of Jesus of Nazareth, who of course is going to be the catalyst for the birth of Christianity. So they kind of date it mainly to around 6th century BCE. And during this time, the emperor in charge of the Roman Empire was Caesar Augustus, or Octavian. So just a little background. So Jesus of Nazareth was born to a Jewish mother and father. So Mary and Joseph were Jewish. That's an important part of the story. They were living in an area of the world that was controlled by the Romans, and Caesar Augustus, who is Octavian, according to the biblical story, had ordered that everybody had to be registered and counted in a census so that he would know for taxing purposes how many people were in his empire. So he is born during the time of Octavian's rule, and by the time he had reached 30, he had gained a great number of followers for his teachings. And his teachings mainly centered on the idea that, yes, there was only one God, and that everybody should be kind and love their neighbor, and that everybody should just basically get along and love each other, and that heaven was open to all people. And it was a universal religion that could apply to anybody in the Roman Empire. It was able to be transferred all over through these series of roads that the Romans had built. People could travel and spread the word of it, and it became very popular. Now, the Romans are going to have a huge problem with Christianity, whereas they didn't really have one with Judaism, which we will talk about shortly. But the long story short of it is that Jesus's teachings raised some issues with some people who were Roman, some people who were also from the area he was living in. We can't just sit there and say it was because they were Jewish, because pretty much everybody in that area was Jewish at the time. So it's not fair to put a label like that. It was just a problem in the area where he was, because there were people who were afraid that his message would essentially cause problems with the Romans, which it did. And after Jesus was crucified, which is a Roman-style method of execution, he was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of the area. And so they made the decision that he was going to be put to death. And then afterwards, the people that saw Jesus as the Messiah that the Christians were waiting for, they became the Christians, that he was the Savior. And the term, Messiah or Savior is kind of one of the things that worried people in this area, because they were afraid the Romans would take it to mean as the Savior of the Romans, and that would cause a problem because the Romans were very proud of their empire and they didn't want anything getting in the way. So just to show you what we're talking about here, this is the Roman Empire, and you can see right here in Judea and Syria and this area where we know much of this to take place, that area was directly controlled by the Romans. It was not a client state, which they basically had their own independent rulers, but they listened to what the Romans said and did. They were kind of puppet states. This was directly controlled by the Romans, which is why they had their Pontius Pilate as the governor basically over this area. Now, at one point, they had allowed the Jewish people there to have their own ruler, King Herod. But then after Herod's death, there kind of broke out into some disagreements, and the Romans just decided to put their own government in place. And even the rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon was commissioned by the Romans. The Romans were totally fine with, maybe not commissioned's the right word, but definitely sanctioned by it. And the temple had a great deal of Roman influence in its design before the Romans will eventually come in and destroy it again. So over time, Christianity is going to spread outside of this area, and it's going to spread through the apostles. And the word apostle means one who travels. And because it was so safe in the Roman Empire, because the Roman military was there protecting it and policing it and making everything safe, and they had these incredible road systems, people were able to travel out and spread this message outside of this area in the Middle East. And when that happens, you've got a large number of people in the Roman Empire by this point who aren't Roman. They don't believe in the same Roman gods, even though the Romans were trying to be adaptive and basically say, your gods can just become part of our pantheon, which is why they have the pantheon. But the more it spread, the more Christianity started to infiltrate the military, and this idea of love your neighbor really got to some of these soldiers who were like, I don't want to fight anymore because I'm supposed to love my neighbor. And the Roman success was entirely built on expansion. So if they weren't expanding, they couldn't bring money in to, pay their soldiers, and their soldiers would eventually rebel, and that was going to be a problem. Plus, Rome relied on a great deal of slave labor, and this message that, heaven was open to everybody greatly appealed to those poorer people in Rome. So we have apostles such as the Apostle Paul, who was really critical in kind of taking all the native religions around the Mediterranean and making them work with Christianity as much as possible. For example, adopting local customs like fertility festivals where they worshiped bunnies or not worship, but celebrated bunnies and baby chicks in sign of fertility, and kind of lumped that in with Easter. Peter, of course, is going to become the first pope or bishop of Rome. Whenever Christianity, he's considered that whenever Christianity really starts to take hold there. And because he went right into the heart of Rome where the Roman emperor was, the descendants of Augustus truly believed that they were gods. And Emperor Nero had a huge problem with somebody coming in saying, do not worship this person as a god. He's not one. And Nero, who truly believed he was one, decided to have Peter crucified upside down, which he made the choice to be upside down because he didn't feel he was worthy to be crucified the same way as Jesus was. So as a result of this, Peter is kind of considered the founder of the Catholic Church in Rome, which will become the seat of the Catholic Church pretty much. And he's buried today under St. Peter's Basilica. He wasn't originally, which is named after him. And all the popes are considered to be the descendants of St. Peter, and they wear the ring of the fisherman because that's what Peter was. So what problem is it exactly that the Romans had with Christianity? Like, what was their general issue with this? Again, one issue was Jesus's teachings of peace and love and loving your neighbor really conflicted with this Roman idea of when in Rome, do as the Romans do, and conquering all of these other areas to bring wealth to the empire. So that was one issue. And then, of course, here was this guy who was saying that people were saying he was the savior, and the Romans kind of took this to mean like the savior from the Roman Empire. But also, the Romans had state gods that were meant to be worshipped. So you could keep your own gods. That was fine. But they kind of became part of just the Roman pantheon of gods. And the Romans had these state gods that were important to ensuring the success of the empire. And this religion, this new belief system said, no, you're not going to worship those other gods. And they viewed that basically as treason. So the Jewish people, and again, I don't even like to say the Jewish people, it was just the people living in the area where Jesus was, were also taking issue with the fact that they were getting the Romans riled up and they didn't want trouble coming to their area. And the fact that they taught different things, like, he was teaching things that were not from the Old Testament, like he was basically going off a different direction. So all of these things kind of combined to cause problems, not only in Judea, but also in the Roman Empire itself, which made Christians become a target, but not just them, the Jewish people became a target as well. So this is kind of an important part of where the art ties into this, all right? Jewish and Christian art are really going to advance under the time that they're ruled by the Romans. And one of the reasons for that is initially the Jewish world had a great time of peace under the Romans. They were initially protected. They were kind of seen as a weird cult that only worshipped one god, but they were initially left alone. Christianity is really going to develop and be born within the Roman Empire, this belief system. So as a result of this, because the Christians were in Rome, that whole idea of when in Rome, do what the Romans do, they're going to adopt the art styles that are around them. So whether they were in Judea itself or in the Roman Empire, like in France or Spain or Italy, you're going to see them adopt Greek and Roman art into their own belief system because that's what they had been exposed to. Plus, by adopting Greco-Roman classical art and architecture, it really helped the Christians to either hide in plain sight or to send a very powerful message later on once it does become legal. So a very big part of this is that in the Old Testament is where we see the Ten Commandments. And Christians and Jews both believe in the Old Testament, but the New Testament has to do with Jesus's life and everything thereafter, which of course the Jewish faith does not follow because they're still waiting on a particular Messiah. So the Old Testament of the Bible had in it these 10 commandments. And the second commandment was, you will not worship any idol or image. So Jewish art was very particular about how they would show things in art. They were very cautious that anything that they were doing could be construed as an idol. So while Jews are still going to be very particular about showing sculptures and images in art that can be portrayed as idols, Christianity, on the other hand, is going to break away from that, because if they do use recognizable images from Greece and Rome, it may help them to kind of blend in, actually, instead of standing out. And so before Christianity is legal, this is a really good way for them to be able to hide in plain sight. So figural art, which we see as figures of animals or people, is going to be okay in Christian art, but not in Jewish art. So this is a really good example of how Christianity is going to help to continue classical Greek and Roman art by adopting what was already happening in Greece and Roman art. So one of the things that they could do, for example, is Jesus was considered to be a teacher. Well, the Greeks and Romans had philosophers. That was very, very common. And the philosophers would be shown in a toga, usually holding a scroll of some kind. So what the Christians would do is they would make paintings or wall paintings or sculptures of a philosopher. But to the Romans and Greeks, or especially the Romans, it may just look like a philosopher or teacher. But the Christians could actually recognize that as that's Jesus, who was a teacher. Right here, for example, this is St. Paul, but they made St. Paul look like the Greek philosopher Sophocles. So it was a really easy way for them to go, no, that's definitely not St. Paul or one of the apostles. That's a Greek philosopher or a teacher, and basically hiding by using the art of the enemy against them. So what we see is something called syncretism, and the key word there is like to sync up or to join up. So what the Christians were doing is syncing up images from Greece and Rome that they had seen in art that were totally pagan and non-Christian or religious in their eyes, and syncing them with meaning that they gave that spoke to them. So for example, grapevines. Greece and Rome had lots of grapevines. Dionysus or Bacchus was their god of wine. So if the Christians put grapevines in there, that could be used as wine, but at the same time, it could represent communion to the Christians. So they're basically, again, hiding right out in plain sight by using the same images that the Romans and the Greeks were so used to. So for example, this is a scene right here where it is in a Christian catacomb. So buried underneath, which we'll talk about the catacombs in a second, but you can see here painted into this archway, which was a Roman, technique in terms of architecture. You can see here that they've got a teacher giving people lessons, and he's wearing a Roman toga. So to anybody else, it could be considered just a teacher. Like maybe the person who is buried here was a teacher, or it was, emphasizing learning, but deep down, this could represent Jesus or a apostle and his teachings to the people. So nothing here makes him stand out as Christ. It's just a symbol that they have synced up a popular image with a new meaning. A very, very popular image at this time to kind of represent Jesus was a good shepherd. So the good shepherd would show up in areas where this is iconography that has been around since the archaic Greeks, because they would often sacrifice lambs to the pagan gods like Zeus. So what you have here is a shepherd dressed very humbly as Jesus was. He's in shepherd's clothing, and he's usually carrying a goat or some kind of lamb. And they were able to disguise Jesus in this way, because this is what this basically represented, because he was a shepherd for his people by being the sacrifice, because he had sacrificed himself. So he's very hidden as humble and discreet and nondescript. So Romans looking at this would be like, oh, well, that's just a shepherd going to do a sacrifice, or a calf bearer bringing a sacrifice to a god or goddess. But in all actuality, it could be Jesus as the shepherd of his flock, or it could be, he as the sacrifice himself. So we're going to see a lot of other symbols that were very common in the Roman Empire that could be ways for them to use figures in art to have different meanings to it. So for example, a fish could also represent baptism because of water, but the letters for fish in Greek could spell out Jesus the Savior. So that was another way to hide it. Lamb could also be sacrifice. Anchor could be, something to do with water or baptism. They would also show Old Testament stories to kind of teach lessons. So like Jonah and the whale, which could just be like a really big fish, could be Jesus's death and resurrection after 3 days. You have Orpheus from Greek mythology, who was very, very good with animals and typically shown with a lion. So that could be Daniel and the lion's den. I don't know why I have Jonah, so sorry about that. A dove could represent the idea of the Holy Spirit, but it was very important that in early Christian art, there was no cross shown. And the reason for this is because a cross was a dead ringer that it was Christian. But also they could, because Romans did commonly use crucifixion, it was something they used, they could have used it, but it was almost an insult to them at first. Like this was what took Jesus's life. So you wouldn't show that because it could be a sign of defeat. So for the longest time, when Christianity develops, it's what I call an underground religion because it was not supposed to be practiced. The Romans would very, very horribly persecute Christians. Nero was known for, who really thought he was a god, putting Christians on crosses and lighting them on fire and using them as streetlights. They would throw them into the circuses and throw them into the gladiator rings and have animals go after the Christians for entertainment. They would do mass crucifixions at one time. They were horrible to them. So to practice this faith or this belief system, it really had to be underground. And so we would also see that sometimes burials were, underground because Christianity believes in burial, whereas the Romans were much more into cremation, like the Greeks. This was more about you needed your body for Judgment Day or for the resurrection. So we start to see not only the religion go underground, but the burials go underground as well, because if people who were Christian were buried above ground, burial was kind of a signal of being Christian. So the people who were burying these people could be persecuted as Christians. So Christians and Jews didn't really have their own cemeteries, and they didn't want to be buried next to pagans either. So what we see is underground in the Roman Empire, particularly in Rome, but also these are in France and Germany as well, are hundreds and hundreds of miles of these catacombs, which were used as burial places. And the art in them is what has helped us to know that they were Christian and also teach us some things about the early Christian church that maybe the modern Christian church doesn't want people necessarily to know, or not so modern, but like in the 1800s and such. So this is just kind of a map in Rome that you can see, like all of these catacombs that are kind of running underneath it. And even St. Peter and St. Paul, who are so important in the Catholic Church, were originally buried in these common public graves. Now, they were required to be outside of city limits. And there used to be this thought that if they were outside of city limits, they must be Christian or Jewish, but that's not the case. The Romans were very advanced in sanitation and didn't want dead bodies, especially diseased ones, buried near healthy people. So cemeteries had to be outside of the city limits. So underground was just another option for this. And St. Louis even eventually did this in the 1840s when we had cholera hit us for the second time of 3 times, and it killed 1 in every 10 people because we didn't have a sewer system, and that was causing cholera outbreaks. So eventually they had the cemeteries moved outside of the city limits to help prevent contamination. Plus all the cemetery ground was being bought up by businesses, which is why in St. Louis to this day, we occasionally uncover a cemetery when we're breaking new ground on a business. So this is a picture of what the catacombs would look like. And you're looking at cubiculi, which is kind of where you would put people to rest, like kind of wrapped up in shrouds and placed there. And there are some of these that had as many as 40,000 burials within them, just to give you kind of an idea of the size. So again, we kind of talked about in these, catacombs, even if somebody was crucified and then was buried, you didn't show the cross because at this particular point, it was seen as a sign of persecution and death and punishment. Plus, it was just a dead ringer giveaway for somebody who was probably Christian. So at this time, it really wasn't shown within these burial grounds. But fortunately, we have a lot of other art that was. So for the 250, the source that they have asked you to know is, or the piece they've asked you to know is the Catacombs of Priscilla. And this was actually given away, a donation of land by her and her family, because it originally belonged to her. And she felt for the martyrs and the Christians who were dying for their faith. And so this massive plot of land, which underneath it was these burial grounds and these cubiculi, there were 40,000 burial spaces at least underground. And we know that there at one time were very wealthy families that were buried down there. So for example, there were these huge marble sarcophagi that were there, but there were also just the common everyday people, because it was this idea of supporting each other as a community. And maybe Priscilla had decided to convert to Christianity, and this was a way to kind of earn her place in heaven. But what's really crazy about this is these Catacombs of Priscilla are one of the greatest early Christian art resources that we have. It is believed that in this area is the first known image of Mary and Jesus. But there are disputes that it is Mary and Jesus, because that would definitively define this as Christian. And there are some people who have wanted to say that this was not actually Christian because of some of the content that is shown. So what we have here is this catacomb became, just over time, this place of rest for so many Christians. In fact, 7 early popes were buried in here. And what we see here is kind of an Etruscan influence, but also a Roman influence. So example, from the houses in Pompeii, because within these homes, you would not have windows facing to the outside, because that could help people see your wealth and possibly rob you. So the inside of your homes and the walls were elaborately painted with these wall frescoes. And so these may have been homes for the dead, kind of this idea of what the Egyptians did, as well as homes of the dead for their people, and the Etruscans. Because look at these wall paintings. Like, these were very elaborate styles that we would see in villas in Pompeii. But even though these were communal, because we know we have in here very, very wealthy people who had their own little side chapels in here. We also have the everyday people, but we also have popes that are in here. But Priscilla herself, for example, was placed in here in a cubicula, like you would have a room in a home. Like, this was her own final resting place within a home until Judgment Day, basically, which wasn't something that Christians really followed. So this was kind of like morphing that Roman, Etruscan, Egyptian idea into this. So within the Catacombs of Priscilla, the most famous area is called the Greek Chapel. All right. And there is a lot going on in here that is hugely up for debate today. So inside the Greek Chapel, there are all these elaborate frescoes, and a lot of them feature what they believe are women. Because, for example, this fresco right over here that you can see to the right actually shows a banquet or feast. And based on what is going on, if this is Christian, then the scene that you're seeing here is the Eucharist, or like basically the Last Supper or communion, where women here are involved in the breaking of the bread and the pouring of the wine. And there's a woman wearing a veil. It appears to be a veil, but it almost looks like there have been efforts made to like take and rub right here where it would look like a shadowed out area to appear to be a man. Because Christian teachings were that, especially in the Catholic Church, once it's established, is that women could not do these kind of ceremonies. In fact, women are still not priests in the Catholic Church, and there were limits as to what women could do. And even St. Paul wrote that one of the biggest responsibilities of a woman is to serve her husband. But here is what it looks like: an early Christian tomb, where these catacombs, where there is a dinner feast going on, where it looks like it could be the Eucharist or communion, and women are involved. That was a huge conflict. And there have been members within the church who have said, nope, nope, this is not a Christian tomb. It can't be, because that is a Roman funeral feast. And women could have been present at that. But those aren't women. Those are men. And if it is Christian, those are definitely men, and it's the Eucharist. But if it's not Christian, then it's could be women and wouldn't be, I mean, it's just this huge debate that goes back and forth. So you can see here, these appear to be, especially the center figure, and it's really good perspective too, because you can see the table laid out in front of them, that would be a woman, because there are fish and there are loaves of bread. So it's kind of like that reference to communion and the breaking of bread, and then like the Last Supper later on. But if this is the Last Supper, there's a problem, because those look like women involved. So there have been people within the Catholic Church who have said, nope, 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 that's not the Last Supper. And this is probably not Christian at all. It's probably Roman pagan, because if those are females, it's definitely not the Eucharist. Here's another scene where you can see a woman holding a baby, but it is very, very like rubbed out. You can see this. This could be the three kings bringing gifts to the baby Jesus, which if that is there, and this is showing the lives of Jesus, then that dinner could definitely be the Last Supper. But this kind of puts, into perspective that there could have been women in power in the church early on. This could potentially be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I believe that's their names, who were in the fire and then came out unscathed. So that's an Old Testament story. Here's another interesting thing that we see here in this particular Greek chapel. You see a woman who's called an orant figure, and an orant figure is involved in praying and communicating with the heavens. But this could be a problem, because again, that looks like a woman. If that's the case, this could be a woman leading prayers. And could even more confirm that women at one point did hold positions in the Catholic Church, that they could be priests. And that was something that was put down later on. So then there's people who say, no, it's not. This could just be the woman who is buried here. And maybe it's her soul of the deceased. And these other pictures are the woman's scenes of her life. But those don't seem to match up with what is happening here with her appearance as an orant figure. And then there's kind of the nail in the coffin, because in the Greek chapel, we also have smack in the middle within this center painting, we have none other than a good shepherd, where of course somebody could go, that could just be a sacrifice to the gods that the Romans were doing. But it's pretty damning evidence that you have here this person who looks like the good shepherd in the middle of what could possibly be an early Catholic Christian burial ground. So Christianity, as you can see, is going to be an underground religion. They have to hide for about 300 years. And unfortunately, a lot of what we have has been destroyed unless it was underground. So that's not unlike Egypt or the Etruscans. But in the year 313, an emperor named Constantine is watching his empire fall apart. And one of the things driving it apart is Christianity. And he makes the decision to legalize Christianity in the year 313. And once Christianity is legal, a lot of big changes are going to happen. So what we see develop in Christianity is a big amount of pride in being Christian, because they've had to hide for so long. And we're going to see the content of art greatly change in the Christian world, because Christian art has grown up in the Roman Empire. They know how to show power off, because they've seen the emperors do it. So they are going to use what is recognizable and what they have seen in art around them. So for example, take a look at this. On the left, we have that Good Shepherd fresco, all right, where Jesus is shown humble and disguised, and he's a humble shepherd. Over here on the right is much later. This is after the legalization of Christianity. Number one, that's a mosaic, which would have taken a lot of time and a lot of money to put together, which shows that it's important. Everything on there is a little piece of glass or tile. And now Jesus is shown wearing purple, like an emperor. He's showing the cross, which is kind of like his defeat of the cross. And he has a halo around his head, which is something the Greeks and the Romans would have done for gods like Apollo, who had a halo, which is kind of like signifying him as the sun or the light. In Christianity, light was everything. He was the light of the world, and light comes from the sun. So they're basically adopting a Roman halo or Greek halo to put around Jesus as a way to show his importance now. So after Christianity is legalized by Constantine, everything starts to change a little bit. Like basically, Jesus is starting to be shown as an emperor because that's how power is projected. They're going to adopt that and show that. So like the purple, he's a king now. He's an emperor. He's, divine, godlike, basically. So this is that same mosaic that I showed you before. What's kind of crazy about this is the more Christianity became legal, the more pagan the art and architecture looks, because they're basically going to adopt what has been around them to show off their new power, because that's what they've seen power projected as. Early Christians and Jews, whenever they were worshiping, they had to do it in secret and in private. But now Christianity is going to become much more organized and much more ritualistic. So we're going to need appropriate buildings with an appropriate size to meet the needs of all the followers. So you are the Christian church. You now are legal. You're the most powerful belief system in the Roman Empire. How do you show that off? Like, how do you visibly do that? And also at the same time, accommodate space for people to come and worship and do all these rituals like baptism and marriage and confirmation and things like that. Well, you've grown up in an empire with by far the greatest architects in the world who've built these huge buildings. So what do? Well, you adopt the style of one of those huge buildings. So the Christians are going to look around and go, we need a multi-purpose building for all kinds of different things that we need to do. So what can we adopt that is a big building that can meet all of our needs? And they looked around and saw the Roman basilicas. That was the perfect thing for them, which was basically Greek and Roman architecture combined. So these basilicas have large interior spaces with places that could be used for these rituals that they need to do and could accommodate a large number of, worshipers. But at the same time, it can also show that we now have taken your style that you used for your temples and your government laws that persecuted us, and we're going to use it now for our places of worship. There was a definite message to this. Now, a couple of housekeeping terms for you. All right, early Christian basilicas are going to be in what's called the axial style. So like axis is you run on a straight line or axis, and that axis points to a particular place. All right. So in basilicas, you have an axis. So this left to right axis, which would actually be west to east, so facing towards the rising sun where Jesus would rise again, according to their story. So you have here this, it's basically a Roman basilica. You have the wide nave in the center. You have two aisles off to the side, which have a colonnade, a row of columns. And then you also have the apse at the end, the rounded apse. So that axis would kind of draw your attention towards the apse where the biggest preachings and ceremonies would take place. What they don't want is a centrally designed building, which centrally is like a circle, like the Pantheon, which the axis is vertical, not horizontal. And everything kind of revolves around that vertical axis like a circle, because the Pantheon was like that, which was to all the Roman gods. So the axial design of the basilica actually separates them from those round kind of temples. So just a couple of terms for you that you would see in a basilica, and which now you're going to see in a Christian basilica. You're standing, if you look at this picture, we would be standing in the nave, all right? Just outside behind us would be a narthex, which is like a gathering place or lobby. Then you would have the apse, which that rounded part down there at the end is the apse, and the axis, this horizontal axis that runs that direction, would guide your eye that way. Then you would have the triforium up here, which is your second floor, and it would be a row of windows. And it was deliberately done to do that, to bring in light. Because remember how important light is to this idea of Jesus being the light and Christianity being the light and bringing light to all these people. So you would have on this second floor the clear story, or those windows, which they would have seen in Egypt. Egypt was part of the Roman Empire. They would have seen that clear story, which is supported by the bottom to bring in all of that light. It wasn't supposed to be a physically intimidating building that was very heavy. It was supposed to be light and full of light. Just to show you guys, this is a floor plan of a basilica, a typical basilica. So the very first basilica we're really going to see is St. Peter's Basilica, kind of designed with the idea by Constantine to mark the place in Rome of where St. Peter was not only crucified, there is a spot to mark that, but also buried. And this kind of became the template for what you do in building a basilica. And to this day, that basilica is the heart of the Roman Catholic Church. And in building St. Peter's Basilica on the inside, they actually took columns from Roman temples and used those in their basilica to kind of show that we have conquered you now, and we're using your temples. We won, our God won, yours lost. So we're going to use your buildings to literally build our church. So this is Santa Sabina, which is one of the only surviving early Christian churches or basilicas. And you can see right here, we're looking at that rounded apse at the end. And you can see it runs on that horizontal axis. You can see from the outside that clear story of windows on the triforium or second floor. Just picture perfect adoption of a Roman basilica into becoming a Christian church. So this is the floor plan of Santa Sabina. And you can see right here the wide nave, the little squares or circles, those are columns to create the aisles. So it's basically taking Greco-Roman style. The rounded area down there is the apse, and that horizontal axis runs that direction, drawing your attention to the apse. And this is the interior. And you can see that the roof is not heavy, and they had to do that on purpose. So basically a wooden coffered roof. So that way, that clear story of windows didn't have to support a heavy marble roof. So that way they could have all of this light coming in. And these walls would have been covered in gold and mosaics and these beautiful images that the light would have reflected off of, creating this heavenly, heavenly feeling as you gazed into the apse. And then you can see Corinthian style columns, which is what the Romans typically took from the Greeks, and using that to hold up. So it's basically pagan architecture that is now holding up the Christian church, even though before it was just destroying it. So Santa Sabina was built in 425 CE, so long after Christianity started and not long after it was actually legalized. And it was put specifically on, so this is important, the location, it was built on top of a temple of Juno, who was Zeus's wife, basically, or, Jupiter's wife. And they took materials from that temple and used it to basically build their own church on top of it. And we can see that, again, that clear story, we're looking at it on the outside, that would have allowed all that light to glitter on the inside and give this appearance of heaven. And not only that, wealth and power, because the Christian church was now more important to people than the Romans ever were. Again, just a couple pictures of the inside that you can see. 24 marble columns that were taken from that temple of Juno. And they actually have these beautiful carvings in there that show the life of Jesus. And, they actually showed the first crucifixion scene that we're aware of. So basically now they're showing it because this is the triumph over death. Crucifixion was Jesus's triumph over death as far as they were concerned. And this church and others like it were the triumph of Christianity over the death that so many faced by the Romans. There was a huge message to that. And these are those Roman panels that you can see here, those wooden panels. So that is our early Christian art. The two pieces they want you to know are the Catacombs of Priscilla and also Santa Sabina, the floor plan and the interior of it.